After playing the original Saga, I was looking forward to continue down the path of playing the other games in the series, like Romancing Saga and Saga Frontier. After a few recommendations, I settled on playing the first Romancing Saga, or rather, the PlayStation 2 remake of it, Romancing Saga Minstrel Song. It's weird to think about the game now because in a lot of ways I would say that the game was ahead of its own time, even with the PlayStation 2 release. Even though Romancing Saga originally came out on the Super Nintendo. You start off Romancing Saga by picking one of 8 characters. Not only do they start off with different stats and abilities, but they all begin their journey in a completely different location on the world with access to completely different places and quests. I started off with Gray, and because I had no idea what I was doing, I didn't pick a starting class for him. Gray might have a bit of an easier start for a new player because he starts off on a small island, so I kind of lucked out. You can learn how the rest of the game works just on that island before spreading out into the rest of the world and getting completely overwhelmed. That's usually one of the biggest complaints people have when they first try playing one of the Saga games after a straightforward first game. After you've picked your character and start playing, you're on your own. You can unlock quests and locations by talking to people in town, and those quests are tracked in your main menu in a notebook. Whether or not you follow through on these quests is entirely up to you. Whether or not you even stay in town is too, since even as Gray, starting off on that little island, you can just get on a boat to a different continent and go wherever the hell you want. I chose to just follow the quests I knew about, playing it like your typical JRPG, following the only quests I knew before advancing, because maybe something story related would follow. So I heard about a dinosaur egg in a cave, retrieved it, and sold that for a good starting pool of money. Then I found my way into a cave that was said to have treasure, and got a decent sword out of it. After that, I got on the boat and set off to explore the world waiting for me out there, and I immediately lost the plot and didn't know what to do when I got there. Whenever people bring up that Romancing Saga doesn't give you directions and that it's easy to not know what to do next, they don't mean that in the general sense that a JRPG might not make it clear where to go. You actually can just go anywhere you want, talk to anyone you want, recruit the party members you want, and do anything you want. So long as your character knows a location exists, it'll be on your world map and you can go there. Even if you can't accomplish anything there yet, sometimes talking to NPCs reveals new locations. Sometimes a new party member knows about a place that seems interesting. Sometimes entire quests depend on having certain party members or items with you, or only become available to you if you started as someone, or completed a quest a certain way. Not long after starting, Romancing Saga becomes incredibly open, and you have to be open about that concept instead of following a steady line or general story to be able to get into it. I recently watched another video by someone on YouTube talking about Romancing Saga, and he actually thought that you just had to grind until the main story continues again, which couldn't be further away from the truth. Because how does a JRPG manage to achieve this openness with a typical turn-based combat system? In most traditional JRPGs, especially ones from the 16-bit era, enemy encounters would limit where you could go on the world map, because if you're not supposed to be going somewhere, monsters would be too strong to survive the area. You might get killed, but hey, you learned your lesson. Romancing Saga avoids this by having the enemies scale. Although they don't scale with your level, as the game has no traditional leveling system, it's kinda like how the original Saga game worked. You gain random stats after combat the way Espers did. That's not the only way to improve your characters though. Sometimes during combat, your characters will learn a new ability and immediately perform it for free of charge. In my experience, the stronger the enemies, the higher the chance your party learns a new ability and gains better stats. Enemies scale based on how many encounters you've had. While running away from combat is 100% guaranteed, and you can always run from combat, it's generally a good idea to stay and fight. Also, running costs life points. They're the hearts in the original Saga game. If your character gets knocked out in combat, your character loses 1 LP. So why run away at all then? Because some quests will put you in the way of monsters you have little to no chance of surviving, and running at least doesn't boot you back to the title screen. On the other hand, after combat, all your characters are at full health, and even get revived so long as they didn't run out of LP. It sounds like such a minor thing, but it changes the combat enough to not just be as grating as it was in the original Saga, where you just wanted to avoid combat from an immediate resource perspective. Not only do enemies become stronger the more you fight, the quests available to you, both main and side quests, depend on what your current event rank is, which is basically an invisible stat counted in the background based on your combat history. You can miss out on quests or fill them if you don't do them when you should. One of the nicer things about how the combat works in Romancing Saga is there is no world map to walk around on, and there are no random encounters. If you know how to zigzag around the enemy AI on the map, you can get pretty far without seeing combat unless you really need to fight. That said, the combat systems in place are really good. There's some interesting twists on the flow of combat with how abilities cost weapon endurance, and I quite enjoyed the combat music and animations. There's also some systems in place to allow skill combos with party members. And overall, for a JRPG, things move at a good pace without wasting too much time. It's quite interesting that a game with such a good combat system wants you to avoid using it as much as you can. Most quests tend to pay out a good amount of gold and gems. Gold is pretty self-explanatory. You buy items with it so you can get better armor and weapons at shops. Shops level up as you buy items from them, improving the quality of their stock. It's a good way to lock off items from shops without basing their inventory on how far into the game their location is. Gems are used to immediately customize and train your party members. You spend them at trainers to improve your character classes, which increases your infinity with weapons and abilities, but you can also use them to train your proficiencies, which are abilities outside of combat, like mining, gathering, climbing, jumping, finding chests. Any proficiency used outside of combat also immediately gives you gems, so if you want to cheese some gems early on, there's a pretty straightforward way to do that. After you've trained enough proficiencies and classes, the game opens up its growth system by letting you purchase their abilities on their own instead of in groups. I still don't know how to feel about a game locking that sort of stuff early on, but I think the idea is that they were afraid that with immediate control early on, you might mess up your character build early game, when it's especially hard to deal with that. Customization doesn't just end there either, since you can customize your weapons through using a blacksmith with the right materials. All of this is a lot to take in at first, and I'm glad I started on a tiny little island instead of that great big world out there, because I can imagine being out there on the main continent and just getting overwhelmed with the directions that you can go in, as well as all the stuff that you need to learn to basically play the game properly. Now, the ideas with life points and weapon endurance might sound more punishing and annoying at first, but they learned their lesson since the original saga. Whenever you stay at an inn, you get to choose between several tiers of room quality, each priced differently. Besides allowing you to save your game and restoring your HP, they can stock you up on healing items, restore your weapon durability, and refresh your life points. So the immediate worry about running out of LP on a character you like or overusing that weapon you want to keep with you is minimized to a point of taking basic care of yourself. Go too long without stocking up and resting in town, and you'll suffer for it. Considering it's tied to the same action that allows you to properly save your game, it's clear what the intent with this was. One thing that's interesting about saving your game in Romancing Saga is that you essentially have two save files by default. You have your in-room save file and your main menu's quick save, which you can load up by selecting continue after starting the game. The separation is interesting in that one save file is always in a safe location in town and the other can be done whenever. I usually ended up using quick save whenever I was in a situation where I'd be deep into a dungeon with no immediate way back, and likely a boss fight ahead, so I could go back to the fight immediately if I wanted to, with the knowledge that if I really cannot win, I could always revert back to the old file back at the inn, before I even set on this dumb mistake of a journey and do something else instead. Besides there being quests that you can fail, or quests that only certain characters can do if you started with them, there's at least one quest I came across that requires multiple playthroughs of the game to finish it. It's an interesting way to do a JRPG series, offering other incentives to replayability through New Game Plus instead of just repeating the same journey with overpowered stats and some bonuses to blast through the same game faster. I think I prefer this over just going through the entire same game again just to get a different ending. What mainly surprises me is that for all its quirks, it's a game that still feels ahead of the cure in time in terms of designing a JRPG. Even looking back to it as a PlayStation 2 era game, a lot of design is so open and forward that I struggle to believe that this was a port of an SNES title. One that spawned two direct sequels and another series on the PlayStation 1 called Saga Frontier. Though the part that really baffles me is that Square made this, especially when this is the company that made a game that's often underlined as Square's first big open world RPG game. A game that often has a lot of shortcomings that are brushed off because it's their first attempt at making something that open, despite there being at least 4 games a lot more open and free before it from the same company. I also think it's quite commendable that the entire game on the PlayStation 2 is fully voice acted.
Well, what's next on the agenda?
I don't know. Maybe we should split up. Since I've got a bit of money to spend, I'd like to go back home to Crystal City to learn some new weapon skills.
Come to think of it, it's been a while since I've been back to Estimir. I need to expand my repertoire. I can't get fire and fire spells alone.
Great! It's me, Jung. We were in the same regiment?
Doesn't ring a bell.
Sure it does. Back then you left the army and saved my butt. You gotta remember that.
Nope, still nothing.
Every bit of dialogue, even from NPCs in town, are fully voiced. Are they voiced well?
I'm hungry, please. I haven't eaten anything for days. I'm hungry, please. I haven't eaten anything for days.
No, definitely not. But they are voiced, which for that era is still fairly impressive. Is Romancing Saga a perfect game? No, not at all. It's incredibly hard to figure out what to do most of the time, and the information from NPCs that's supposed to set you in a direction on a quest is so vague it's almost impossible to get ahead without using a guide. The early game especially makes it hard to figure out what to spend your resources on, and there's a lot of trial and error involved into making any sense of what is going on until the moment it starts coming together hours later. There is a main story buried somewhere beneath all the side quests, and you'll be in pretty deep long before you even untangle it from the rest of the game. For me, it took until the game clock was at about 8 hours before I finally had a feeling that I knew what I was doing and how things really worked. And I don't even want to know what the actual playtime was if I'd included all the times I reverted back to a previous save file. Is Romancing Saga worth getting into? Definitely. If you want to experience a traditional 16-bit era style of game, taking on the concepts of exploring an open world and customizing your stats, weapons, team lineup, then absolutely go for it. Don't just blindly follow guides either. Look up guides when you find a quest and you don't know how to advance it further. It is fairly easy to come across side quests and stuff to do in the game, but it's going to be really hard to actually know how to beat them most of the time, because the game text is not really all that helpful. The next Saga game I'll play will likely be Saga Frontier, which should be interesting because it goes for a science fiction setting instead of your typical fantasy world. Anyway, this was Above Up. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see ya.